Welcome to the Mixed Media Podcast. Today we have some interesting topics. We're talking about John Williams, the act structure of movies, and pre-ordering. So remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and if you go to the link on the side, you can find the link to all of our places everywhere, pretty much. We'd like it if you joined our Discord. That'd be pretty nice, because we need some more activity there, and it's not the greatest over there. It's a bit dry currently. And with that, I guess we'll go into introductions. So I am a game designer and a 3D modeler, and I guess we'll go to Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Costello. I'm a flute player and a media composer.
And I'm Irving. I'm a media entrepreneur and filmmaker.
Nice. All right. So, I guess we'll go into our first topic, which will be about John Williams, and Ben will be responding. Oh, I guess I'll let you introduce your own topic. So.
Oh, sure. Do you want to just go through, like, we normally briefly go through what we all done this week? Do you want to start with that?
Sure. Yeah. Sorry, I'm not used to hosting this.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. I don't have a whole lot to say because I'm on vacation this week and next week, so I haven't done too much artistically other than spend a lot of time looking at various John Williams quotes, I was trying to hunt for something in particular that he said. I remember reading, and it led me down a rabbit hole of reading like a whole bunch of interviews with him, which is how we're going to get to my topic. But other than that, I haven't done that much.
All right. What about you, Aaron?
It's been a really crazy busy week, but not in any like particularly interesting ways. So it's kind of boring. A lot of like back end company stuff. I think the most interesting thing is worked with a small business to launch some products like a 3D virtual tour, little cutesy advertisement, and they were happy with it, which always makes me happy when clients are happy. So. Other than that, nothing too interesting. Oh, playing around with my 3D printer. Here's my company logogram 3D printed. So there you
go. Nice.
As for me, same sort of deal. Nothing interesting. Just been busy with school stuff, internship stuff, and whatnot. But nothing to report about this week, pretty much. So I guess we'll go into our hot takes, and while Ben introduces his thing, I'm going to close the windows because I'm currently glowing and it's pretty strange, so I'll be right back.
Okay, well, like I just mentioned a second ago, I was looking for a particular John Williams quote. I can't even remember why I was looking for it, but I was looking for a particular quote that I read many years ago, and it turns out it took me a really long time to find the quote that I was looking for. But I ended up reading a whole bunch of interviews from him from past 2020, I think going back to 1997 is the earliest interview I found. So interesting things. So I figured I would respond to some of them. Some of them are kind of in pairs here. Yeah, so obviously John Williams, we've talked quite a bit about him on this show as
for sure
unavoidable. He's kind of the king of film composing, if not of all time, and certainly of our lifetimes in the past probably 45 years. So I'm still composing. I'm not sure I'd still say he's still at the top of his game now that he's about to turn 90 in a month or so, but he's still working on Indiana Jones 5 somehow, so he doesn't quit writing. I'll start with some quotes about what John Williams listens to and what kind of composers have influenced his work. When I listen to his work, I like to think of things that, this specific composer must have had some influence on him, or whatever. He doesn't really get into that in general. I listen to some obscure British composer who, I personally can't believe that he didn't and hasn't been influenced by that, but he has some interesting things to say on what he does listen to, which is not that much. Okay, so this is a theme that runs through maybe probably every interview that I've read of his. He talks about not listening to other people's music, which is fascinating to me. Because I think most composers that I know spend a lot of time listening to music in general.
That is really bizarre, actually.
Yeah.
Didn't you say that Hans Zimmer said the same thing, and then you didn't disagree? That you didn't agree, I meant to say.
Yes. Now Zimmer, I think he makes a point though that you should listen to I think the Symphonie Fantastique and what was the other piece? Mahler's Second Symphony, and that's all of music right there. It take me a minute to find exactly where the quote is from, but the interviewer asks John Williams, I'm going to just read this here, "What do you listen to for inspiration?" He responds, "I don't listen a lot because I'm working all the time on something, and listening to music is not a particular help. It's difficult to go to concerts, and often one is listening to music that is better than one's own, and that isn't particularly encouraging either. My work, particularly the film work, puts me into a particular setting, and it isn't helpful to be jarred out of that. Also, people will put music on when they have a dinner party, and I can't do that, or listen to music in the car. Because I start listening to the music, I think that D could be a little bit more sharp, or it's a little flat, or whatever. And before you know it, I've lost the dinner table conversation entirely, or I'm risking driving off the road. If you were to ask me what I would hear just for pleasure, I'd probably say Haydn, even more than Mozart in my case." Okay, so there's a couple of thoughts there. Number one, which is true. He says, essentially, if I'm writing something, I don't want to listen to a lot of other people because that's going to kind of distract me from what I'm doing. And that I understand. Okay, if you're in the middle of trying to write something and you start listening to something else that's really good, my tendency, and I think a lot of people's tendency tends to be, you're going to kind of subconsciously move towards what you're listening to. So I understand not listening to something while you're working. And he says, I'm working all the time on something. Maybe back in like the early 2000s he was. I don't know how much he's really working on something these days, but I'll take him at that. And a couple other ideas in there. One is that if I listen to music, and he says this in many interviews, that because he spent so many thousands of hours in recording studios trying to make sure that every detail is perfect, that he notices imperfect details in any recording he listens to. Okay, so that's kind of funny to me. But I suppose if you're John Williams and you've done as much as you have in a recording studio, then you probably do have that instinct, as he says, to be like, wow, that D is a little flat, and then he goes off the road. Okay, so it was a little humorous. But I suppose I understand that. I certainly can't relate to that, but so that makes sense. And finally, he says that it's not encouraging to listen to other composers who are better than you. So that's to me maybe the most fascinating part of what he says there, because, and again, this is a theme that runs through like every one of his interviews, that he doesn't want to compare himself. He doesn't think he's anywhere near the same league as all these lists, the canonical composers. And he finds it discouraging to listen to their music because their music is just so much better than his.
I find this to be like the exact opposite for me. It's like seeing people who are better than me just makes me be like, oh yeah, it'd be great if I could do that, Like, I'll never get there, but that's like a nice thing to aim for, I find it like, does he find it encouraging that there are people who are worse than him? Does it work the other way around too, or? I
mean, he would probably. He's a humble guy, so I imagine he wouldn't say that there are many people who are worse than him. It's certainly not how I work as a composer. I certainly need to like be surrounded by great stuff to like remind me of how to attempt to touch greatness. So, and most people I feel like would say that John Williams is in that league anyway. So I guess he's clearly a very humble person. Doesn't think that he's matching up with he tends to list the big canonical composers, being Germanic composers, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, and Brahms. Is the composers he talks about. He also talks a lot about Wagner in a negative sense, which I think I have a quote here that I sent. If not, I can just read it, where he talks about why he does not listen to Wagner at all.
While you read it, I'll pull it up.
Okay, I might not have sent that one, but also fascinating to me though that he says if I listen just for pleasure, I'd probably listen to Haydn even more than Mozart. And I found 3 separate interviews where he says that Haydn is essentially, he thinks, the best composer, which I'll let you react to that. How many people you hear people talking about Haydn being the best composer?
Not particularly. No, that's definitely a new one.
Yeah, Haydn is kind of a musical afterthought, I would say, of the classical period. He's like he also ran. He's the guy who kind of came up with all these forms that Mozart and Beethoven used, but he just came up with them. He came up with the symphony form, came up with the string quartet, and just wrote a lot. So that's really interesting. That makes me want to listen to a lot more Haydn.
Well, it's kind of strange that these are his favorite people, but he hasn't listened to them, regularly.
Yeah.
It's like, how does that end up influencing his work, or like, does it influence his work at all?
So there's another quote, actually this text, but he says, "I tell you as a composer, it's very interesting. You take the first page of a Beethoven symphony after the introduction and give me 12 bars, and then try to write the next page. You can't do it. No matter how much skill you have and how much training, you can't go there in his brain. The ordering is a divine gift." That gets at what he does do. And I'm not sure I have a quote for this, but basically what he does is he takes the score and just reads the score. So he's not going to be distracted by like an actual musician not playing in tune. And he just kind of imagines the theoretical ideal in his head, which is good. Score studying is important. And basically, that's what he does. He listens to the music in its theoretical ideal in his head. And he asks himself, like, if I take the introduction of a Beethoven symphony, and the first, like the introduction and then the first 12 bars with the theme, clearly he's tried to do this. He's tried to, like, what would I write next if I had that myself? And he compares what he would do to Beethoven. So that's a fascinating exercise. I suppose that could show you why you feel like you're inferior. But I don't feel like that's a relevant comparison, because Williams is, not like, it's not an atonal composer, but we're talking about like Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms are composing within a key in very rigid structures that they kind of push all of them in their own ways, or Haydn creates the form. But Williams, yes, I mean, it's tonal-ish. A lot of his pieces like have a key that they're roughly in, or moments in music, but he's really not writing in that same sort of idiom at all. Like, you can't compare a Mozart symphony to Hedwig's theme from the beginning of Harry Potter. Like, they're just completely different worlds. So again, I find it really fascinating that he's so interested in comparing himself negatively to these things, that obviously you can learn a lot from, but they just feel like they're so removed from what he does that I don't know why you should feel like, why he feels such pressure to, like, not pressure, why he feels like he's not living up to them, and why that's what he studies. So interesting information for anyone who's out there, any aspiring composers out there, that Williams, one, does not listen to a whole lot of music. He likes Haydn, and he likes generally the big canonical German composers and tonal composers, and that he kind of listens to them in his head and studies them that way. So that's really interesting to me, but not what I would have expected.
Bizarre.
Do you detect that like sort of style of those composers in his music at all? Because you think like if he studies it right, like it would appear somehow, you know?
Yeah, that's a good point. So like, what reflection do they have in his music? I can see like the really like the clarity of his string arranging and string writing is probably related in to the clarity of like uh, Mozart and Beethoven, and I need to listen to a lot more Haydn, but presumably Haydn, um, and how so I'd say that probably in the string writing that he does most similar, not necessarily in terms of like how they're like writing melodies, but in terms of how he's kind of balancing things and like the clarity within them. That's probably something I should look more into. I know at one point in college I'm going to listen to all of Haydn's symphonies. I got through like 6 out of his like 104 symphonies.
My goodness. Wow.
Yeah, Haydn he could churn out music. So that's maybe my another question for me to dive more into Haydn and to come up with a better answer of how Haydn is reflected in Williams. So interesting point to ponder. Yeah. So that's what John Williams listens to. And again, like if you ask me what composers do I think have the most influence on him, they would not come anywhere like into the top 20, but like I come up with a whole bunch of composers I imagine have more influence on him.
He doesn't do many interviews, does he, John Williams?
No, he doesn't. I was reading something unrelated to this quest, but something recently where some young composer in like his college class wrote or called John Williams' agent, whatever agency represents him, and said like, "Hey, I'm writing this paper, for my college class, and I'd like to interview John Williams. Is there any chance you can make that happen?" And the person like laughed at him. No way. So
yeah. I don't think he's like such a legend, but it's so weird because like I've rarely ever heard him like his literal voice, and that's very bizarre. But he doesn't really make much of a figure of himself.
No, there's that line. I think I have the quote in here from this most recent interview. I think back in middle of 2019, where I got a lot of these quotes. But it's something along the line of he says, "I'm standing on the shoulders of giants," and the interviewer says, "Well, I think you're one of the giants yourself," and he says, "Well, I wasn't large enough to play football."
Oh.
So I guess that shows you his sense of humor.
That's funny.
Yeah. So right, actually, I do have the quote here. It says, "But you're sure." He says, "I don't think in the art of music, I don't think there's any place for that kind of vanity. I don't know who else could possibly feel that way given the shoulders you're standing on." The interviewer says, "But your shoulders are pretty broad and strong at this point. You're part of that foundation now." And he says, "Well, I couldn't get into the NFL." So clearly he's a kind of like humorously humble figure. Okay. So some more quotes from him that some points I'd like to make. He has a whole bunch of quotes about why he specifically does not watch any films that he scores after they're released, which makes sense. As he points out, I've already watched it like 1,000 times anyway. I don't need to see it again. And then he says that every theater has a different sound balancing system, so the sound is ruined anyway.
Oh, poor guy.
Yeah. So
I would love to hear his recommendations though for what is the perfect, you know, or at least what is the best experience he's ever had in a theater. That would be interesting.
Yeah, that's a good question. So he kind of piggyback along with like what we were talking about, Bach and Haydn, Mozart. So he says in another interview, because the greatest writing in music has been this development out of church music into Bach, and finally Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, and so on. The art of arranging notes and tones has never reached a higher point than that. That was the apex, probably, of tonal organization. We've since gone to some aspects of total disorganization. Very exciting and the way to go, but we still have always the great masters to look at, without envy and the greatest admiration ever possible, at least in my case. So again, he's looking very much at that line of Germanic composers and tonal music.
And an interesting thing he says about the future, though, like about, the way things are going, he says they're exciting, which I find fascinating.
Right. So that's weird to me too, that like he wants to look back at them, but the way to go, the future is disorganization. So
he doesn't get any. Well, how do you know that, right? Like that means he must know what's going on, right? Like he must listen to other people.
I mean, I think he would say that he's disorganization, probably, especially compared to them.
I guess, but like what he's saying, right, is that like composers nowadays are shifting away from the sort of organized way that things work, right? So he must know the way the masses are moving, which means he, at least in some sense, takes in a lot of modern songs, right?
Yeah.
So who does he listen to then?
I mean,
question.
I don't know.
He doesn't mention anyone else outside of the ye olden times composers in this interview.
Yeah, I mean, he came up as a jazz pianist. So
interesting. Did not know that.
Oh yeah, he was a kind of jazz pianist. Did a lot of classical piano as well, and was also very involved in military music, because that's what he did. Instead of being drafted and going to Vietnam, he joined the one of the army bands, I think, maybe the Air Force band, and played piano and arranged for them for a couple years. So his background is in a little bit more popular music, actually. All right, so I have two more sets of quotes that I kind of want to get through. So he says, discussing the commitment of his art, what it demands. Well, anybody that writes knows that thinking about what you are writing is a 24/7 thing. You get in bed at night and you think, that should be this tune, or that should be a different key, or whatever. It shouldn't be an oboe. It ought to be a flute. Now that's at 1 a.m. in the morning, and it's very hard maybe to decompartmentalize these things, decompartmentalize these kinds of activities for people who do what I do. One thing I would say about it is that it's a great privilege to be able to work the way I do. But it is so intense that you neglect things. The interviewer says, and he says, you can neglect people. You can neglect family. I have wonderful children. My late wife is gone, but my present wife is very happy. But it does so consume your life, this work, which it really shouldn't. A lot of the work that I do is certainly not that important, but the process of doing it is so all-consuming. Just the word that you use, just to suggest the word that you use, that is the truth of it. It isn't a sometimes thing; it's a full-time thing. For me, it's an interesting quote where, I mean, obviously that rings true to me. That when you're working on something, you're gonna spend a lot of time thinking about it, even when you are trying to do other things. I totally get that. And he says it's hard to decompartmentalize these things. You can't just say I'm going to compose now and then I'm not going to think about what I'm doing. But it's also fascinating that he says that basically it seems like he has a happy family, but he says one, that what he does is not that important in the scheme of things, and that the all-consuming nature of it can affect relationships with people, which is kind of a fear of mine. I don't think I'll ever do anything on the scale of Williams, so hopefully I don't run into that problem. But it's interesting that he says that, and it gets into that work-life balance.
Yep, definitely, definitely something that's hard to take care of.
I thought was interesting is that he said that, like, I mean, you agreed with him the part where that, like, you're doing this 24/7 thinking about whatever your current project is. But so I've been studying a lot of EDM artists, and that seems to be sort of the opposite for them. It's like they may have like some thoughts of like, oh, this would sound cool or whatever, but when they get to work, right, like it's a set work time, and then they just like that's their whole experimentation time and trying to figure out what would sound good. It's not like a process where they're like thinking up things, or Deadmau5 very specifically said that he'll never think of of any melody outside of his working time. He just like sits down and he tries like a billion different things, and he's like, oh yeah, I really like this. And I don't know, maybe it's different because I think this is like EDM is very structured. Like it's very similar each song in terms of their structure. I think for them, for the artists, it's a lot more about creating a unique tone than it is about creating a unique melody, for example, right? So, like everyone's heard like 70 EDM songs where the melody is just like some triad being arpeggiated over and over again, and it's like, all right, this is not interesting. But the tone is interesting, all right? I think that's the point, and I think that's why, because it's perhaps a bit harder to think up those things like while like you're doing other things, right? You have to for example, like reducing like the bit rate on like a synth, right? That's hard to think of like what that's actually going to sound like. So you need to actually go and do it, and I think that's why they have that different approach of just like they just do it instead of thinking about it outside of their work time, I guess.
I would like to be able to do that. I'm going to think about music then not think about it. I think Williams would probably like to do that too. Sounds like so good. It's good to know that composing at that level can, in Williams' opinion, can lead to some issues like neglecting other people. But it's also comforting to know that Williams and all people also struggles with that. So something to watch out for. But it's even the greatest composers have that problem. The last quote that I want to read here is actually the quote that I had been trying to find when I started looking at some of these quotes, and this is going to come with a slight bit of criticism, and this kind of touches a little bit on some of the stuff we've already talked about with him being kind of self-deprecating in a kind of good-natured way. So he says, there are some individual things that I've done. The Imperial March seems to me a perfectly shaped piece that works very well. I could probably name half a dozen other little things, but my character in psychology is one of being self-critical and wanting to improve things, he tells me. I have to say that I don't listen to things that I've done in the past almost ever. Once in a while, I might have a reason to. My reaction is usually, oh, that's pretty good, but it would be better if I had done this or that. I have a self-critic placed deep within me, and I don't think I can ever really feel perfect satisfaction. Why I was thinking of this quote initially is he mentions at the start that some small things, half a dozen things, including in particular the Imperial March, he thinks he's done a good job with. Which, okay, so I don't know what the other things are. I think pretty much everyone out there is going to agree that the Imperial March, Darth Vader's theme, is fantastic, iconic piece of music. So I don't think there's any disagreement there. What bothers me a little bit about this quote, and maybe I'm reading this the wrong way, or not reading it the wrong way, but trying to extrapolate a little bit. I sort of get the sense when I read this that we talked probably a couple months ago. I talked about publication in film scores and how John Williams will not allow his scores to be published, even as the industry is maybe, ever so slightly starting to like allow that to happen. Maybe like James Horner in particular, his wife is kind of pushing to get all of his scores published. So that's great. But why Williams will only allow his scores to go to some special archive at Juilliard where nobody's ever going to see it. So I have to imagine that part of the reason is that, obviously the studios don't want to lose his work, but if the composer pushes for it, I think it's very possible that these scores can get published. How to Train Your Dragon was published with John Powell pushing for it. Took a while for the studio to relent. I think if John Williams pushed for his scores to be released and not just thrown into an archive where, maybe the one person on earth who's ever interested in looking at them will look at them. I think that's sort of his opinion. Look, if he wants to be one of the greats, or if he wants to be in the same conversation, which maybe he doesn't, but he's clearly comparing himself to them. Whether their music is great or not, all of these composers put their music out to the world, and that's something that he's not doing. I feel like there's some element of like him thinking that most of what I've done is not worth anyone hearing. There's another quote where he essentially says that like everything that you need, everything of quality from my works is already published and it's already on the official soundtracks. You don't need expanded versions of my soundtracks that have every bit of music. You just need like the big themes that are on the official soundtrack. You don't need what has been, like every note from the score. You just need the highlights, because that's all, you need like the Darth Vader's theme as arranged and published, not as it actually appears in the film. And I feel like part of that is just this intense self-criticism that he gets at here, where only like 6 things I've written are good, and I'll never not be so self-critical as my psychology, right? I just really wish that he would get over that. I think that if he didn't have that attitude quite so much, that some more of his stuff would actually be out there. And maybe he doesn't think that we all care, or that he's an influential and important composer, but he obviously is. He's the most important composer of the last 45 years, even outside of the film world. No classical, in air quotes, composer is as significant as he is and has been in the past 45 years. There's so many people who just want to study what he did, and you might not think that every note that you wrote was best, Mr. Williams, but it's better than anything the rest of us are going to come up with. We want to see it. So that's my reaction to that.
Now, if you're listening to this and you agree, like, clip this section. And does he have a Twitter? I don't know if he has a Twitter.
Probably not.
I don't know where you can find him. Find his publicist or manager or someone. Send them the clip of this.
Whoever is representing him, whatever agent represents him.
Yeah. Just send him this bit about Ben's appreciation, and honestly on the behalf of the entire community too. That we all appreciate his work, and we would love to benefit from it in more ways than just one. So, yeah.
That's my section on some of John Williams's interviews. A lot of fascinating stuff, and if you ever have some way of listening to this, Mr. Williams, we really do want more of your work, not just the highlights.
Yeah.
According to John Williams' fan website, it would seem that he can only be contacted through his phone number, which I assume is not his phone number personally, but some like secretary's phone number. But yeah, and his address is known, so if you want to, I guess, if you're in California, just be like, hey, I saw this video. You might want to see this.
Yeah, it'd be funny to send a CD with a clip from the podcast on it. Yeah.
That's definitely one way to confuse him.